our committee that you had with regard to data that you're willing to look at. We appreciate the fact that you are owning this process because it is supposed to be not a district-led process, but a community parent-led process. And while we facilitate the discussion and provide the information, it is truly your meeting to have those discussions. And so last week we had quite a bit of discussion with regard to scenarios. And we had two of our members who took it upon themselves, which is excellent, to look a little bit deeper and to prepare some additional scenarios for us to look at tonight. And again, we have district personnel on the line virtually who can answer questions. And what we would like to do is, in order to maximize our time of discussion, to have Dan and Dorian share out the scenarios that they presented, and then we have the opportunity to thoroughly discuss. And then once we get to that point, then I will conclude the meeting with what our next steps are. We may have to have another meeting, but we need to look at, I'll go ahead and put it out there. We need to look at the format by which we will share information with the board formally. And that would be the committee looking at who the spokesperson or combination of spokespeople might be and how we want to share that information out. And we'll make sure that we prepare that information and work with whomever that speaker may be. And then we will have the scenarios that we will look to present to the board. If all of that is not done tonight, it's okay. But if we realize at the end of this meeting that we need to have another meeting to get to that point, then we can absolutely do that because we have the time in our schedule to be able to do that. So with that, Dorian, would you like to go first?
Well, can I start with a couple questions?
Absolutely.
Great. So I thank you for the new information that you presented us tonight. I was comparing this printout that I did from tonight, it's new, I believe, with the one from last time. It looks similar, and I think I understand that last time you gave us 5th grade growth data, and this time this is all grades. That's the difference.
This is the dual language with all grades.
So that was my mistake.
Oh, this is dual language in it?
Nope.
Okay, this is dual language.
Correct.
And this is the NWA for all grades.
All grades,
Oh, like
all reading, all math. Last time I did
So this is
mistakenly.
kindergarten through 5th grade?
Yes, it's all.
Okay. And it's interesting how different they come out, not entirely different, but there are schools that completely flip from the top of the list to the bottom of the list, which is interesting. Like I think Giffen is one that here, if 50 is one, there's one school year's worth of growth. In the one you gave us today, Giffen is 51, Giffen and Montessori ranking the highest kind of growth. It was one of the lowest ones, I think number 10 out of 11, but when you look at only 5th grade. So I guess that brings me to questions about what to make of and how to interpret this data. And then I guess a follow-up question about this is, so is this 1 year, winter to spring?
Yes, it is winter to spring within the same year. So you're looking at the same students.
Right. So, I mean, that makes me think, I guess I have 2 questions. I'll ask them both, and then there's maybe a question for you, Superintendent Adams, or for some of the other administrators here. One, should we be looking at a bigger data set? Should we be averaging a bunch of years together so it's not sort of a random fluke of, well, a couple 5th grade classes are really great that year, but we should look at more students over more years to really see the trends. And number 2, can you explain again why growth is better than scores?
So I'm going to let Dr. Wilson Turner do that, because basically she supervises the elementary division, and then Michelle Bridgewater, if she wants to chime in, because she works with receivership schools. And I'll just start by saying growth actually helps us determine this instructional delivery, because you see exactly where the students are strong, and you see it over multiple months, and it's more like that formative assessment that you can really drive your instruction.
I should see as a teacher why that would be so important.
Right, the achievement score is that snapshot, that moment in time, and while the growth is as well, what it measures though is where the student started and where they are in this particular time. So it is more formative so that you can drive instruction. But Dr. Wilson-Turner, if you will provide some additional information.
I mean, you provided the gist of it. I mean, the difference between, growth scores versus score percentiles. We rely a lot on growth for the exact reason you mentioned. It tells us the impact of our instruction on those students as well as their capacity to grow in that way. Whereas scores percentiles don't fluctuate very much. They're pretty consistent over time because it takes a great deal to move, through a percentile. As to why one is better than the other to look at, I wouldn't say that. I would say they both serve different purposes. Score percentile gives you an authentic picture of, as Mrs. Adams said, that snapshot in time in terms of how that child performs in relation to all the other students who take that test in the nation. Whereas the growth score is going to tell you what the impact of instruction has been on that student and whether they've received at least a year or more worth of growth based on where they started from. And so you'll tend to see in some schools that children have a longer way to go, but that are in our lower percentile, but their capacity for growth is sometimes even higher than those in students who are higher score percentiles.
Okay.
If I remember correctly, the state accountability also looks at growth and factors that into how schools overall are assessed, correct?
Yes. So I guess, and maybe I misunderstood. I guess I left the last meeting thinking, forget about score percentiles. We just want to look at growth. That's a better way for us to balance schools, balance middle schools. But then in conversations after that meeting, thinking about looking at how the growth numbers play out and seeing there are some very high poverty elementary schools where the scores tend to be low overall, but the growth is high, which is wonderful. Those kids are learning, right? But if you take, let's say 3 imaginary schools, one that tends to have lower scores, one that tends to have very high scores, one middle, and of course this is about poverty more than anything else, right, and privilege, we understand that. And each of them grow, let's say each one grows exactly the same thing, 51, do you say percent, 51, we'll just say 51. You could say, okay, so those are our highest growth elementary schools. We're going to send one to North Albany, one to Myers, one to Hackett, sort of spread out our high growth elementary schools. But then those schools function very differently. Like I feel like if we build around that, we could easily have middle schools that look balanced based on growth percentiles. But you could still have a middle school with all the high poverty schools, a middle school with all the privileged, higher academically achieving schools, and not achieve true balance. So that makes me come back to, like, I guess, what Cecily was just saying, that we do need score percentiles as well. And I might argue that those may actually be more important, which brings us back to what we worked maybe 2 meetings ago. Is this making any sense?
Discussion.
I can understand your viewpoint, wanting to see the data of how everybody's improving and basically a line graph of showing that everybody's improving, but you're improving at different levels.
Right. Equally, but someone's gone from low to a little higher,
Yeah.
someone's gone from high to very high,
Right.
but that's not the same thing.
The slope is it's the same. The slope for all these schools is almost the same, but are they all at the same grade level?
Right, and if we want to make equitable schools, we want a school that has one of the high achieving schools and one of the lower schools and some middle schools. Like that makes for a more balanced, integrated middle school, if that's our goal, right?
But not necessarily give you our balance in that way because in what because the achieve as President Adams said, the test scores are one snapshot in time, right? So it doesn't necessarily reflect what the programming needs to be in each school in order to be balanced and meet students' needs. So I'm not, quite honestly, I don't necessarily think that growth or even achievement is going to give us, it's going to make us have balanced middle school because I keep going back to this. We actually have Look at all the characteristics of the students in each elementary school and actually build programs that meet those needs. One of which is academics and and how maximum growth. But it's not.
I hear you. I mean, I hate that we have a system, and then, you know, here we are, we can't change it, this education system that we're all part of, that puts so much emphasis on standardized testing. Right? In the ideal world, we would look at kids and education learning differently, but then the question is, if not that, when you're looking at these large numbers of students, then what is that? I'd love you to do that.
I'm sorry, but they said that the test scores are an accurate snapshot of where every student stands on that day. Growth is interesting, but if I have an 8 and she has a 7 and you have a 2 and you have a 3 and you both have way higher growth scores than us, we're still far, far ahead. That ultimately growth is interesting and it feeds into teaching and how you approach a student, but it doesn't seem to have very much to do with how you construct a balanced school. That the test scores are snapshots of students on that day. Growth isn't a snapshot of anything, and it's not possible, just at least as I was modeling it, it's not possible to integrate growth onto a test score to predict where they'd be at the end. That ultimately you need to come up with some objective thing to be ranking and calculating and doing. And growth, I think is definitely worth measuring and is interesting and it helps teachers and it helps curriculum, but I just don't think it's how you rank a school. It doesn't tell you where anyone stands and it doesn't tell you where anyone will stand after you're done reshuffling.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you, and maybe growth is useful at the very end. You're close, you've got a scenario, you're thinking, I'm kind of liking this one. And you're looking at trading some schools around, maybe you want to trade, you're looking at some schools with very similar scores. Maybe that's when you say, well, this one has higher growth and this one is lower, and maybe this makes more sense in something. But I think it's much more of a nuanced fine-tuned factor at the very end, as opposed to a primary organizing factor.
We almost need to know the number of kids that have the growth for the age appropriate level. Have they grown X amount for 5th grade to the appropriate level of 5th grade? Have they grown up 50% or 50 for the appropriate level of 4th grade?
Right, and that's what scores would tell us.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think what's important to understand is that each child has their own growth target, and each child is measured toward what the what they call the grade level score is. It's called a grade level RIT. And so you're measuring their growth towards that. And what growth is really telling you is the impact of the school and the teacher on the learning of the child, and the child's ability to grow during the course of that school year. So it's a significant data point for us, because it tells us how schools are growing children, regardless of the score percentile that the child enters with. And as you noted, oftentimes we see that some of what are considered our lower performing groups of students tend to have higher growth in some of our schools that are identified as struggling as such, which means those schools are growing those students significantly more in some instances than other places are. So it's a valuable tool for us in that vein. It's also a valuable tool in terms of how students are marking towards the target we have for them to close that gap between them, between their score and what the grade level score is in other schools that are high performing. So that's the growth piece of it. I get what the conversation is around trying to balance it strictly based on academics, but there's a reason why the growth score is used. Both in the NWA and the New York State assessment to measure the impact of how students are growing and progressing under instruction.
Yeah.
I didn't know if Ms. Bridgewater had a comment. I didn't know if you. Okay.
But it's almost like the growth of each cohort or each school should be looked at to determine the level of experience of the staff that you're going to build the middle school with, to see how much, what kind of resources the students need there, right? To actually have their maximum growth so they can learn. And for us here, trying to decide what school goes where, or which students go where, is a little more tricky. It's a little, because I don't know. Things I would love to be able to look at it, so.
Do you want to
I
share?
mean, I can share, but in some ways, as the conversation evolves, you know, so does what we do with this. So, I took in basic concept, which I'm glad to explain, is he did far more detailed work and tried far more scenarios. What I did since the last meeting was took out scores, which were state test scores, and instead used growth percentiles. I add together math and reading to give just an all, a single all score for each one, which you'll see down here where it says average with district traditional growth percentiles, to give each school one number. Because it seems like trying to get into the weeds of this school is a little high in math and a little low in reading, just gets like hard to process and parse that much data. When in general, these scores you can track relatively together. So I can put one number for each school, weighted that by multiplying it out by our estimated number of students. Do we have that data yet, the number of students per grade?
We do, that's in our gradation report, but we do have that.
Okay, that would be helpful, just to, that will, you know, having our, whatever we decide that we should be using for our scores or our growth percentiles, I would say, I think my first choice would be several years, 5 years of average NWEA. I think fifth grade schools. I'd be happy to have a conversation about, should we be looking at all K-5 and use that as the school's score, or should we be saying where did this school's kids emerge in fifth grade? Where do they end up? And I think I would say fifth grade. But that's more, that tells you what kind of kids is this school putting out in the end. So I think I would request fifth grade, NWEA, 3 to 5 years, happy to have conversation about whether it be 3 years or 5 years, average score percentiles. And then I plug those numbers in, but I would argue that the way that because this is growth, and I'm now arguing that that's not what we should be using for this purpose, even though I see the value of growth for the district overall. And just play around with different combinations. And so you'll see under district scenario 1, it has, you know, various combinations, and then it gives the average weighted numbers at the bottom. And now I'm going to put the difference of 474. And my goal was to get that number as small as I could. And in this case, I think my scenario 8.1 got the smallest difference, it's down to 289. But again, I think this way of going about it, I think it can work and can be effective, but I think I would want different data to actually, which will give us completely different results. So, and I also added a number of our guess, really Dan's guess, of number of students in 6th grade. But having those actual numbers will also help us get more accurate conclusions. So I think at this point, my little spreadsheet here is an approach to thinking about it, but not useful at all in terms of actual numbers because I don't like the numbers that are in here. I think we can use a better data set to arrive at better.
I like the idea you have. I'd like to also see the separation of math and English because going through this, you can see that some of these math is really close together, but then the English is far apart.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
It's hard to find one situation where everything is equal.
Yeah.
And so this situation, you're blinded because you're blinded. So
Yeah, and I appreciate that it's Dan's, he did that, he's got it all separated out, so you can really see.
I've circled everything that has a close range of less than 5, and I don't see any situation where it's both are closer than 5.
It's just that looking at Dan's now, I think.
Yes.
I reordered it a little, it'll make sense when I go through it.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I crossed out anything that was greater than 10. I said, no, we can't do it, it's too much of a spread. But there's a few situations where it's worthwhile. Actually, district scenario 4 still looks good. One doesn't look so good, and those were the two I think we were looking at.
Last time, yeah.
And then some other ones too in here look okay. I think scenario 7 looked good. 13, look, they looked okay. Yeah.
I'll tell you.
Do we have Dan walk us through it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Or
If anybody else
I
is
just wanted to make sure that we were ready.
Yeah, all right.
All right. All right, cool. So here we go. Okay. So, I tried to model all the different scenarios, and when you look at it, the yellow cells in the top part are really just what's changed. That all I'm really modeling in the top is the amount of change the district would experience, the amount of change in the alignment patterns. And so you look at the district scenarios 1 through 4, and you can kind of see what the goals, I think, are. The goals are to improve North Albany. And, they do it by having between 4 and 6 changes in alignment pattern. And I think when you're looking, the amount of change in the alignment is one criteria. And I'd say there's really only 2 other criteria. It's you want to have relatively even schools academically, and you want relatively even schools population-wise. So if every school had the same score, well, the district's average is just the average of all the schools. So if every school had the same score, they'd have the district average. So I wrote the district average down. So from there, the colors above that are really just what it would take from the current alignment to hit the district average. And you can see the key below it. You'd need to raise the score 5 points is bright green, between 1 and 5 is light green. So to get the current middle schools to the district average, this is what you'd hope to see, So when you do this, I started building all these different scenarios. And you can see I get to 28 scenarios. And they're all pretty even on score, and it makes it so you really have no idea how you're going to pick. And so really, the only other thing we really need to be modeling is population, that there's 600 kids, you want relatively even schools, and I think you really can't overstate how important population is, that it lets you have teachers get even resources, there's even classes, there's not overcrowding, it gives you versatility in both the school administration and in the classroom. It's just, you really want even schools. And so once you say that's a goal, I think that's really important. And so I don't think it's that possible to hit 200. Like, how are you going to mathematically hit it 3 times, right? So I just said, let's take 50 on either side. A school that's between 550 and 650, that's great. And then I said, well, look, I don't want to get too strict. Let's say any school between 500 and 550 and 650 and 700. Let's mark it different. Let's take note of it, but it's not out. And then let's just say, look, any school under 500 or over 700 is out. It's unbalanced from the beginning. That's why we're here. So you got to have a school between 500 and 700 ultimately is I think a good goal. So if you say you want even schools, both on grades and population, and you don't want a ton of change, those are 3 really simple criteria to lay out. So you start looking at it and you lay on population. So if you go down to the district scenarios, all 4 of them are unbalanced from the beginning. They all create schools that are over 750 people, and you just can't do that. So I would say all 4 of the district scenarios, why isn't this?
I'm sorry, Dan. So the lines that say school total, those are population totals?
You have an old sheet. I updated this
Oh,
since, so
But
it's easier to
still,
look
but
at.
still, those titles would still be the same.
Right, yeah. So I just multiplied what the school would be. Entering class in 3 years, that's what the school would be, right? So the first 4 scenarios, they're just unbalanced. You just can't do that. So I think from there,
it's really tempting to say, well, maybe we could do this surgically. You know, you look at 5 through 8. Let's change 1 or 2 schools and see what we could do. And you look at the grades and they look about even, they look fine. But again, you go down and 5 through 8 have schools that are over 700 people. They're just unbalanced. You really can't do that. So I'd say 5 through 8 are out. So then I think it's really tempting to say, well, maybe we'll have all these kids walking to school. You know, we're going to have neighborhood schools and everyone will go to the school closest to them. So if you do that, scenario 9, you know, all the schools are balanced population wise, but if you go up and there's not a lot of change, but if you go up, you can say, wow, it makes North Albany worse, which if anything, that's a criteria that is just, we're not going to do that. You can't make North Albany worse. So I think you get rid of scenario 9. I think the important part of this though is anytime you put Montessori and New Scotland together, you get a wildly unbalanced school. You just can't put Montessori and New Scotland together. And so that's really what happened to Myers in scenario 9. So scenario 9's out. So then you go to scenario 10. And I think it's tempting to say, well, the Magnets, they never picked a neighborhood school. They're from all over the city. Let's let the Magnets re-pick a middle school. So if you had it as a neighborhood grouping and you let people pick, and you go down to population, North Albany is already full. No one else is going to North Albany. So you're splitting 3 class cohorts into 2 schools for basically no reason. And it doesn't improve North Albany. So scenario 10's out. So scenario 11, the current grouping, you let the magnet schools go wherever they want. It's, you know, technically every school has room, but you're going to let 20 kids go to Hackett. And then again, you're splitting up 3 class cohorts to go to 2 schools for basically no reason. So scenario 11, I'd say, is out. So now you really get into, hey, let's really focus on population. Like you got to balance population. All the rest of these are reasonably balanced. 12 and 13 are the only 2 that have 2 that are in the pink, that are not within that 100 student range. So, I mean, with that many other scenarios, I just say, let's not do 12 and 13. So you move over to 14. And so from here, 14, again, this is one, Montessori and New Scotland are together. It makes an outlier school. You know, I just think you shouldn't be doing that. So then you go to 15. And then you're at 15, and I think 15, 16, and 17 all have the same problem, that you're always, it's averaging, right? Like you're gonna have to reduce the scores of the other 2 schools to improve the scores of the other one. But I think 15, 16, and 17 are the only ones where you make both schools uniformly worse in order to do it. And there are just other scenarios so you can do better. So now you go to 18. So, you know, now I think the final, you know, so 18, all the rest, the population's fine. You go up and you look at the scores. You know, I would say 18 kind of has the wrong direction. It makes both schools worse, except for Hackett, where it improves Hackett's score, which I just don't think we should be improving Myers and Hackett, because it always comes at the expense of the other 2 schools. Like that's not, we just don't have the room to do that. So I would say 18 is out. So now we have 19 through 28. I'd say those are really the last, those are the 10 reasonable scenarios to consider. So from 19 to 28, I mean, you can just, you scroll up and you look at how much change is involved. I just think on change alone, you can say, look, we can't change the alignment of every single school in the district except 1, 2, or 3. So I think 19 through 23 are out. So ultimately, I think we're really picking between 24 through 28. And so when you look at 24 through 28, you scroll down, the populations are all kind of fine. You know, I mean, they're a little, some are more balanced than others, but they're within the bounds. I think I'd say, well, you know, 24 and 25, they make 2 schools worse when you have other options. So I'd say 24 and 25 are out. So then you're down to the last 3. I think at this point, it really just matters what you want with a magnet school. If you want a magnet school at each, you know, that's its own decision point. I didn't think it mattered exactly, but if you think it matters, then, that's how you pick between these three. If you look at them, 26 and 28 are the same scenario. The schools, the orders are just moved around, right? Like the schools are just moved. But it has a big impact on the school itself. That 26 versus 28, you're making two schools more than 5 points worse, or in 28, you're not. So in that way, I'd say you're really picking between 27 and 28. 27 has the most even English scores. It's the only scenario where I could get all the English scores above 20. It's the most even. But it doesn't have a magnet school at North Albany. 28, it's also pretty even. Its population is more even, but it doesn't improve them quite in the same way. But I think 27 and 28 are really like the best two. I think 24 through 28 are the top 5, and I think 19 through 28 are the top 10, as I would kind of rank it. There are 3 criteria. All it is its population, how close to average are we, and how much change is involved for the district. Because I think while you can talk, there's 11 schools, there's millions of permutations if you really just want to come up with combinations. But I think with those 3 criteria, there really aren't that many combinations that satisfy those 3 things. And I think we all agree on them. It's like even population, basically even grades, not a ton of change. And so that's really the model. I mean, I'm happy to add any others on the fly. I mean, it's pretty easy to add. I just, ultimately it's the rules I got from it are like, you can't put Montessori and New Scotland together. You end up with really unbalanced schools. And you should do your best to not make Hackett and Myers worse in making North Albany better, because you can. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Dan. This is really helpful and great stuff. And I know you just kept playing and playing. Well, here's another one. Well, here's another one. We wish he and I were texting a little bit. What if you move this one over here? But this is based on this growth or test scores?
This is based on test scores, just because that's where the kids are. I can layer growth on it, but since ultimately, I think that's the thing. If you look at the beginning, just what each school would need to be. To me, that's how I started doing this. I just said, well, let me just match the amount of change, So you scroll over and you say, you start doing it and you go, oh, well, I need 2 greens and I know I need to make Hackett's English more than 5 points worse to bring it closer to average. So you start just trying to match the colors. And, over here, I got a ton that are pretty close, where I bring the Hackett English score down more than 5 points and I make North Albany. So, I mean, you can kind of do it that way, but.
And this is state test scores, right? And I guess that's another question. Or I think I heard that, and you haven't given us this data, but I think I heard that in WEA, we feel like it'd be a better, if we're going to use test scores, we're better off using a WEA than state test scores. Fewer kids opt out. It's a better test. Is that true?
Fewer kids do opt out of the NWE. We have more students that take the NWE. That's also one of the reasons that we use it, because we have, more students take it.
Yeah. And I've heard teachers say like, oh, I learn more from it. It's more helpful to me as a teacher.
I mean, I think I'd say that in some ways, the scores don't exactly matter. That this is really more about direction. That North Albany needs to be a lot better, and Myers' English score needs to come closer to average, more than 5 points worse. So tweaking it, adding a growth percentage, it all would fit in the model, and it just wouldn't matter in terms of model, because big picture, we need to get better, we need to make this a little worse, and the amount of grades and the amount of, it doesn't exactly matter for the model.
Yeah, I agree with you that the general trends are going to be the same regardless.
Right.
And I realize also, because you have this all built, that taking out, plugging in different set of score numbers, it would all
And it would all go through it. We could change anything you want if we have
And I
different.
think that's probably worth doing, is I do, my sense, you know, is that my understanding is that at the very, it's a better data set.
Yeah, so here's the data set that,
And having those
See,
actual numbers of students each grade, in case we're off. We talked about, I think last time, like 3 years of averages for those. But I think the general philosophy and the general trends, you know, are all there.
yeah, I mean, I think you can say, look, if we talk about the last 10, where you can say, look, they're all basically balanced on population, which I think we're trying to do. They're all close-ish to, you know, what we're trying to do. They move toward the average in the right ways. I think it's really, that's 10 scenarios, like real concrete scenarios we can talk about. I think the real question is, you know, is 19 through 23 just too much change? Like, can we say that we can't change that much? Maybe we can, like, maybe we can say, well, who cares where the elementaries go? But if we can't, you know, if we want to say there's too much change, I think you can knock those out. So I think we can talk about like really specific ones. I think we should be talking about 24 through 28. I think those all work. I think they're population balanced. I think grade-wise they're balanced. I think they don't involve too much change, and like anything else that hits those 3 criteria, which are pretty broad criteria, I think we should talk about too. But I think it's like, well, let's just figure out what hits these 3 very broad criteria, because it actually limits the universe a lot more than you'd think. Like even though they sound kind of innocuous, you know, let's have fairly even populations and grades, that's a really limiting factor when you're making combinations. So in that way, I think these are what we really can talk about. Anything else you want me to model, I can, I don't.
Can we find out what's more important, population or getting the grades close together? What's her desire? Tough question, sorry.
That is a tough question. It would have to be a balance of both.
Yeah.
I don't see one sacrificing the other, because here's the thing, if you increase the population, then you may reduce the success.
Right. And
If you
yeah.
increase the success, you may drop the numbers, but you can also increase them. I mean, so.
Can we say 700 is a line that we don't want?
700 is not something that we would want to do.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, that's really what I'm modeling.
We looked at 650 for middle school, and that's where we try to stay. We know that we're not balanced now because North Albany is under construction and we only have 21 classrooms available, but beginning in the fall, we would have more available.
We're sure about that, just because I've seen construction work.
We are moving forward in a very positive way. We are on track with North Albany. And so we're going to stay positive and send out those positive vibes that North Albany will be. And just so that you know, one of the things with North Albany is we're actually a year ahead of what we originally planned.
Okay.
So that's a very good sign
Right.
that it's come back that way. So we're going to keep those positive vibes going.
Fair enough, no, I just wanted to ask.
And I think all these that are pink, you know, I put the school numbers below it. They're not on these sheets just because I put it on too late. But, you know, all the ones in pink are at least they're between 650 and 700. But, and I think they're all worth considering. I think that's the thing. Like, once you say, look, even up to 700, it's worth considering. And you just make these very broad criteria of want the school to have between 500 and 700, which everyone agrees on. And I want everyone to have, the schools to have as balanced the grades as we can. You know, I think that it's not as open of a universe as you'd think. So I tried to model really what I thought did that, you know, and I think in some sense the model goes in order, that starting at number 1, they get better. That I would, you know, I would get rid of 1 through, I got rid of it in groups, right? Like 1 through 4 don't work, 5 through 8 don't work, you know, but they all don't work for different reasons, but in that way, like they get better. I would say the last 10 all at least meet those 3 very broad criteria and are worth discussing beyond that. And I really, it's like the last 5, because the so, 10 through 6 of the last ones really just involve an incredible amount of change, which I do think is too much.
About the level of change that the district is comfortable with, it will be very useful to actually hear what you guys have to say, because on one hand, I believe that, not having a lot of change will be a smoother transition. On the other hand, if you're gonna shake things up, shake things up. And so that nobody can claim, in a way, better to have a school district now, you
Versus just a few.
yeah, no. But it will be useful to hear your perspective on this so that we can have a conversation about that as well.
So I think, and I know that, I think Lauren McKenna is on the line as well, and we can talk about what that change means, especially for middle school. Typically, the school will build a culture. And so you have a way of doing things, which yes, is consistent and in alignment with the district goals and objectives, but each school has their own unique character. And so the more change you place on that organization, the more you're now changing that culture. Now, typically, having been a middle school principal, you're looking at 3 years to stabilize that change, because when your 6th graders become 8th graders, they are the true role models because they have been through the school. But then your 7th graders are also part of that, and so really and truly, you're really working with your 6th graders in that whole transition and adjustment to middle school. So you're looking at what is that going to be over a 3-year period. And so I think the culture of the school is very important, the leadership of the school is very important, and all of those things play a part when we talk about the change and what a particular school can handle. But I would turn it over to, again, Dr. Wilson-Turner, Ms. McKenna, and Ms. Bridgewater to have comments about how change and changing patterns impacts the school.
I think it's hard to tell. I think if the students are if, for example, if next year 7th and 8th grade students remain in their same school building, they've been acclimated to the building expectations, routines, and culture of that building, and those children typically set the tone for the building. And then you bring in your 6th graders and you get them acclimated to what we do here at this particular school building. So I don't know if the change would be as significant as we initially think as you transition those, a different group of kids in. But we've done it a couple times. Like we've changed who's fed into Myers. We've changed who's fed into Hackett. And I think it's a lot of factors, not just the children, but filtering into the building. It's the other changes that occur within a school year that we don't necessarily have control over that may impact how that plays out. So I think it's hard to tell, but I do think you'd have some consistency if the majority of the children are remaining in the building for 7th and 8th grade.
Well, I guess I could just, in looking at the last 10, right, that I personally would say get rid of all the big change ones first, and I'd be at the last, 5 to consider. I think the other way you could say it is, well, look, of 19 through 28, I'd get rid of the ones that impact 2 schools. So I'd get rid negatively. So I'd get rid of 19 because it impacts 2 schools negatively, except where it brings up a grade that it shouldn't really be trying to. So it does it at the expense. So I'd get rid of 19. I'd get rid of probably 24 and 25. And probably 26 that you could do it grade wise, right? And it's just direction. That's why the actual specific grades aren't really that important, that you can say, well, look, these, regardless of the scores, they're either going up or down. And so they're going to be down at these levels. So I think, I would say, okay, well, if you don't care about how much change, I would say the ones you're really considering are 20, 21, 22, 23, and then 27, 28. So I think you can, no matter what, you can narrow it down to 6, 5, 6. out of that 10, depending on how you then frame it. You know, if you say, oh, well, the amount of change matters the most, you'd cut these ones first. If the impact on the grades matters the most, you know, I'd just count the number of red squares and say, okay, I'm gonna get rid of anything that has 2 + 5 impacts. Why wouldn't I? Because I have other options that don't do that. So I think a lot of this model is really about just seeing, it's not about any specific answer, it's about saying, well, I have other options that do better. And it's really just about being able to compare the options and saying, well, that does better, you know, and not getting bogged down in the theory of it.
I would toss one more ball on what we're talking about. I do value minimal change. I think that's important and valuable for families because there are relationships with parents and families and teachers and knowledge of how a school works. If the younger siblings went to the orchestra concert or whatever it might be, I think there's value in minimizing change. It's not the most important value, but I think it should be considered. But I would add one more thing to the mix, which is these distances and these zones. I think we have schools currently that are sort of crisscrossing and have long crisscrossed from one side of the city to the other to go to middle school. And I think if we have some scenarios that we're considering that are similar to each other, and one of them means one school or 2 schools don't have to crisscross as much, or there are more students going to schools that are closer than the neighborhood scenario, which is appealing, even though it doesn't work by itself. But if we can infuse a little neighborhood by saying, well, look, this one is similar, but there's 2 schools that don't have to crisscross the city, they can go to a school that's closer.
Yeah, I mean, I
That's
guess,
another factor worth considering.
I think I view the decision kind of as a funnel, right? Like, the first thing we're deciding is just population. And then from there, we want even population. From there, if we get even population, we go, well, do we have about even grades? And then from there, we go, well, is there a lot of change involved? And then if it passes that test, we go, well, is it, then we can layer anything else on the one. Does it have the right amount of busing? Does it have whatever you want? But I think it's like, that's the order of the questions, right? That it has to pass the population test before you move on to any other questions. So once it passes population, it's, okay, well, are the grades about even? And then once it passes that second checkpoint, it's, so I think the questions definitely have an order, and I think the order matters in the way that it's going to leave very few things, that it's not, well, maybe there's another thing that hits it's like, well, I couldn't build it. I tried to build as many different scenarios as I could, and some of them just weren't worth pursuing. Like when I said Montessori and New Scotland shouldn't be together. It's not worth building any model that had them at any school. It just wasn't worth doing. So, in that way, I thought it was a way to really kind of close off building a million different things and saying, these are just our questions. Like, does it hit population? Does it hit grades? Does it hit the amount of change? I think there's so little left after you do that, that if you want to apply, a bus lens to the last 5 of them, I think you can, but would you, I don't know how, I guess I'm not sure how I'd do it. I'd be happy to layer it on. I guess I could put distances.
Yeah, I mean, they gave us distances here, although complicated, but you can probably figure it out.
One of the commonalities, though, that you have with the last 5, 24 through 28, is, the most change is 6.
Yeah.
The least is 5. And you're still within the 3 points that you stated would be your primary criteria.
Yeah.
If you have an even population, close to the average academically or growth, and then the amount of change is roughly the same.
So the other question I had.
But remember, the committee will present recommendations to the board. And so the board will ultimately, they're going to want to ask us questions about what are the recommendations coming forward. And if that's, first of all, if that's the criteria that we're settling on, which is a logical criteria, is a logical, make sure I say that correctly, it is a logical criteria because it captures the things that we have talked about all along.
I think the only question I didn't answer that is open in it is it important to have a magnet school at every middle school? That I would say 27 is the most even. And in that way, if we're pursuing, close, trying to make there be as little variance as possible, 27 in some ways is a great, scenario, but it doesn't have a magnet school at North Albany. And so I think that's really, if I'm going to name a fourth question, you know, of like, well, we just need to decide these four things and it'll pretty much be, it'll spit out an answer. It's like, do we need a magnet school at every middle school? And I think that's, you know, I don't know we do. I don't know the magnet schools are an anchor in some way that the middle schools need them, but I could see wanting that. So I would say that's like the fourth question in order, right? And then anything else anyone wants to layer on, I mean, I'm happy to do it, but I think it really, there aren't that many possibilities. Like, I think we can really just say, like, these are the ones it's gonna be. I'm happy to try and build any others, but population is really a lot more limiting than you'd think. Like, just trying to make even schools, numbers wise, like no grades, no nothing, even just population is really tough.
I don't believe we need a magnet at every school, because I think somebody used the term magnety maybe in the first meeting, like chose this and all that magnety and the way its scores look and use how they function in a more magnety way. For whatever that term, I mean, whatever meaninglessness that term has, but I don't necessarily believe we have to have a magnet at every.
I don't see it that way, no, I don't see it as a form. I think that.
I'm sorry, I can't.
I don't look at, I personally believe that each middle school should have one magnet, and the reason for that is not the sports for me. It's more about magnet schools capture from the entire city. And if you're, in my head, it's fair to have one school that captures from all over the city to go to one middle school, whichever is closest to it, or if that's a criterion, or whichever, or whatever the criterion is. But it's not about the scores for me. It's more about, so we have this group of people this group of students who have gone through elementary school together, and they should feed into a middle school, and knowing already that there is some sort of, there isn't, the distance isn't really the thing for them because they're going to magnet school, you know, maybe going to Montessori and you live all the way downtown, right? So it for whatever reason. So that was my logic. And that's why I think that it's fair to do that, because you're sort of inconveniencing three schools, if you will, equally in that respect.
And there is still a fourth magnet program that we still isn't in here.
Dual. So the one thing I'd say for dual is just the data I used was for DCS. It contained dual. So the test scores and the population are in it. So you could break it out and have a lower population and different test scores listed for dual. But functionally, as long as I say wherever DCS goes in this model, dual goes there, the model works just fine. I can break it out and we can move it around, right. And that would actually get a lot more versatility, because moving a 20-person small, you know, it's small. I think
it's small, and then but it's also doubling. Although the current class of kindergarten is the first one, so we've got a bunch of years till they're in kindergarten.
But you're only talking about
right. So it's 6 years. 6 years from now, it'll be 48 instead of 22.
I mean, for the model's purposes, it's easiest to think of it as part of DCS, just because the math is all the same and
sure, that's where it was.
Just. But I mean, you could break it out.
Well, if there's interest in spreading out the magnets, it gives us another way to spread out magnets.
Oh, I was saying. Well, I guess that's, if you're looking at the scenarios at the top, 25 and 27 don't have magnet schools at every one. So I'd say that's like the fourth question I asked in trying to build it.
So this is a relevant question. Can we ever chime in?
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. Sorry I couldn't be there. I have a kid with a pending test, so I thought it'd be better for me not to come in person. This is Talia. So my first question before my comment, because it influences, is when you're talking about population, I've been following all this, and also thank you for laying all these different scenarios out and putting all this in a spreadsheet. When you did your population counting and you were saying some scenarios put us above 700 and it's just not realistic, did you use that based on real numbers or based on your estimated numbers?
I went to the SCD website and got the total population of the schools, and then just divide it by the number of grades. I didn't get given a direct number of students. The whole sheet will update if I change it. Ron and I talked about it, they're right. When you change them, I changed some of them. Doreen gave me some updated numbers and I changed it. It really doesn't functionally impact the sheet because ultimately you're just trying to move up or down and dividing, instead of by 70, dividing by 75, it doesn't change the numbers that much. But yeah, you're right. I actually can't say those numbers are spot on.
Well, and I'm okay with it being estimated numbers if it's going to truly be representative, because if we're using some educated guess numbers telling us we're above, we're too high or we're at the sweet spot with the population, and then we find the real numbers are drastically different, then that's a different conversation. If it is, reasonably representative, then that's fine. So that was my first question. The other thing is in terms of layering on, I don't know how you would fit it in. I would agree if there is a way to just have an understanding of what impact the transportation piece might have. We may not be able to let that be a huge deciding factor, but it would be helpful if we're, say, narrowing it down to 3 or 4 different options to have that transportation information there to help us choose between those small, not 20 something options, but when we get down to less options. The other piece that I know I've talked about before that if it can be placed is the number of students with special needs and what impact that's going to be. So how many, with, scenario, I'm just looking at a number, scenario 23 versus scenario 5, how many kids with special needs are going to be newly entering that middle school on an average basis when comparing the different scenarios? Because right now it is uneven. I know we're looking to make it, even in as many ways as we realistically can, but I think that needs to be one of the areas that we should attempt to consider if we can. And I believe we were given some numbers before, but I don't think they were at the elementary level. I thought, if I recall correctly, they were at the middle school level. So if there's a way to get not a score or an actual number, but like Arbor Hill 5th graders is going to increase the number of kids with special needs, whatever that definition is, by this many when they go to this middle school. And then how many coming out of New Scotland are going to, what is that impact going to have? So that's another number I'd like to see layered on as well.
So what I will say is for special education program placement, it's not that they follow their neighborhood school. So even sometimes during elementary school, those children are going to different schools to go where their program is. And so there are particular programs that are run at Hackett, at Myers, and then at North Albany. And so what we would need to look at is what program strands run at each school, and then look at how those numbers are balanced that way. And typically those classes will move together. I think where you may have some consideration is co-teach, right? Because those kids do tend to move with their neighborhood school. So I think the impact would be around how we could balance with self-contained populations based on the program strands that we place at those schools.
That totally makes sense. I forgot to take that part into consideration because I was aware of that. Thank you. But any kind of information that we could get to just give us some semblance of what impact that would have with these different elementary groupings that we're having. And also, I think you referenced this, Cecily, but I didn't fully catch it. So if a student is, say, because I know, and I don't know if this is still the case, but in the past, when I was a caseworker, like there was a student whose home school was Arbor Hill, but because of their programming needs, they went to New Scotland. Where would their middle school be? Would their middle school be based on New Scotland or based on Arbor Hill?
Nope, it would be based on where that program is. Right. So when I think about,
oh, okay.
Yep.
So they could go to a middle school that's not even connected to Arbor Hill or New Scotland if
correct.
That's there. Okay.
Yep.
So I guess you all would know this, the district would know better what kinds of numbers we should be layering on It may not be an actual like aggregate number, but some sort of number to just help us understand that we're not going to be putting like a higher percentage of kids with special needs all in one place. Again, we're not going to be able to do it perfectly, but just like transportation and everything else, but it'd be nice to know if we're choosing between the top 5, we could rule out something that's going to have a significant discrepancy. It'd be nice to have that.
I mean,
If
what
there's a
I
way.
probably could tell you is which schools have a co-teach program, right? And how that may impact feeder. But again, because the program is driven by, our special education placement is driven by program, we have the opportunity to kind of retrofit that after the fact to make sure that we have the program strand that we need at each building. And try to create the least disruption for those students, especially knowing that some of them, like for some of them, they go to one building for K to 2, and then they pick up their next strand at another building 3 to 5. So there is some variability. And each year, the program needs of our special education population changes. And so it makes it even more fluid and difficult to predict. And so we try to go based on space and, the data that we're not offsetting one school over the other.
So do you think once we get it more narrowed down, if it's not actual numbers, but once we get it more narrowed down for all the different criteria we're looking at, do you think that would be an ideal time that you could then just anecdotally tell us this is the kind of potential impact scenario A would have over scenario C based on the way things look? It probably would be, I would imagine it'd be a little bit easier once you get it narrowed down to not.
Once it's narrowed down,
20.
you could apply what the current populations are that, strands that are at the buildings and see how that would influence the overall number for each building. And if anything would have to change significantly for those strands or not, based on what our final look would be, our final couple of options would be. Yeah.
Okay, so just instead of me asking for numbers being layered on, just hoping we can keep that in mind to have that conversation as we get it narrowed down.
No, I think that's a great point.
Thank you, everybody.
We have the top 3 pieces of criteria, and then the 4th would be, is the question of, do we need to have a magnet school at each middle school, then the transportation lens, then the special education lens. So those are things that absolutely, if you're saying, and I'm just gonna go from what I'm hearing, if I'm hearing that, or if we're saying that scenarios 24 through 28 are scenarios that we're looking at, then looking at the layer of, well, the magnet school layer, you can already see that, but then looking at what's the transportation impact, what does that look like in terms of transportation, and then what does that look like in terms of maybe our self-contained programs and our co-teach programs in the building. And then if you wanted to, and this is totally up to the committee what the next steps would be, if you wanted to narrow it down to just 26, 27, and 28, or did you want to look at 24 through 28? That would really be up to the committee for us to then provide that information for a little bit more discussion.
So maybe 25, it says at the top, it doesn't say 1 magnet each, but I believe it does at 1 magnet. I'm missing something.
On which one?
25?
Oh, I thought, I'm sorry.
I think it actually does.
All right, no.
We'll go back over here. For those who care. So the only one here that doesn't, I think, is 27.
Well, I guess just, if we're gonna, just because I would want to reach a conclusion, if I narrowed it to 24 through 28, right? I would say 24, 25, and 26, just they affect Hackett and Myers more negatively than 27 and 28 do. Just comparatively, they have a worse impact. So I would eliminate them in favor of the other two, because I just say, well, 27 and 28 are better. And so if I'm at 27 and 28, I think you can say they both do a good job of matching the movement toward average that you'd expect. They both improve North Albany. They both decrease Hackett's English score. They both do what you'd expect. I think, 27 and 28 are really, if I'm calling it down to 2, that's what it really comes down to. Like, the other ones, 24, 25, and 26, they're good, and I think we can talk about them, but I guess I would say, like, well, you're more negatively impacting Myers and have to. So to me, it's really down to 27 and 28. Depends whether you want a magnet school is really, and then poof, you have your choice, you know? I guess once we're layering on busing and special needs and all sorts of things, it makes a lot more sense to broaden the criteria, but I just think like, I think 28 is just clearly the best one to me, that it has a magnet school, its population are all evenly balanced, the grades are pretty much evenly balanced, that is the right amount of change, that, you know, I do want a magnet school at each more than I don't, you know, all things being equal. So I guess, you know, that's kind of how I would decide. It's like, well, look, of the last 10, I just want less change rather than more. So now I'm at the last 5. And of those, it's like, well, I want the grades to move positively rather than negatively. So then I'm down to the last 2. And then, well, I guess I'd want a magnet school at each one. And then I'm at 28. So like, to me, it's the questions themselves just drive forward in a way that, you know, that's why I want to answer the questions in that way.
So let me go back, just to review the criteria. Number 1, population. Number 2, closest to the average and looking at the performance of students. Number 3, the amount of change from what is currently existing to what is being proposed. 4 would be, is it necessary to have a magnet school at each of the middle school? Well, have a magnet school feed into each of the middle schools. The transportation lens, how many, you know, what's the impact of students traveling greater than 1.5 miles? And then the special education needs in terms of self-contained and co-teach programs.
I'm not sure I agree with 28, because yes, the English scores are somewhat close together, but the math far apart. 13 for Hackett, 24 for Myers.
I guess I just, for the math, I was never really able to get the variance to less than 10. So the minimum variance I was able to do was 10. I think there was like 1 where I was able to get it really close, but it had like other problems in a bunch of other ways, but
Nardo 13.
in almost all of them, the variance is between 10 and 12, so.
13 and 20.
13.
And 20,
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you
20 has a
can
good population, I think 13 had a good population.
I mean, 20 still has a variance of the same, you know, 11, 10 to 12, but all the math variances are just, I wasn't able to build schools that are that close. Like the English you can mess with, the math, I was never able to construct a school. Like, I think I found one I did.
It comes close.
It's real, the math, the English you can, yeah, the math I couldn't really do. I figured 10 as a variance, 10 to 12 was like reasonable. I thought, you know, in the same way, I just go back to like what the current scores are. It's like, well, increasing what's wrong just isn't an option. So I just want to make things better. So it doesn't exactly matter where you land. It's just like, well, we should be trying to make things better. So in that way, you know, I thought these colors are the direction we should be heading. And to me, the variance, it's like, well, I want to have the same or less variance if I can. You know, I don't want to increase the variance. And so, you know, the variance in the math of the current schools is the same, you know, 12, 13. It's just, it's really not. It's very difficult to build any school of any combination.
I totally agree, I see that, but also, we're gonna have to ask the question, does the school district or school board wanna deal with scenario 23, where almost every school is changing? How many parents are gonna be calling up the school board then?
Yeah, which is why I got rid of it.
Yeah.
And I think that the way of thinking, I think we're really honing in, like we're really, this is feeling like this within our grasp. I would just love to plug in NWEA numbers, because having not seen them myself, I think some of these small, minute differences, when we have kids opting out of this test, the teacher could say it's not the test, it's its own problem, we don't, you know, test. I would love to plug those numbers in And I believe you when you say it's gonna come out mostly the same, I'm sure that's true. But once we're down to these fine-tuned differences, I would love to have like real numbers that we feel better about. And then really dive in, then I think we're ready to be like, okay, let's grapple.
I mean, I think I'd just say, like, I made sure to color all the grades white if it was within a point up or down, in order to show that, like, this is statistical noise, that anything
Sure.
close to the score is the same score,
Yeah.
that you need a lot of movement to be able to be represented in this chart, and in that way, it makes the model really resilient, that like, the little kind of scores you're talking about aren't gonna change direction, and that's really ultimately all that matters, like, are you moving up, you know, that it's just, I don't think.
Yeah, but I haven't seen those, I haven't seen them side by side, so I believe they're probably very similar, but I don't really know.
Sure.
And what year did we say this test scores were, the state test scores? They were from 2 years ago?
Spring of 2019.
No.
2009.
Spring of 2018.
18-19 school year.
Okay, 1890. So NWA, presumably we have NWA that is more recent
Right.
from last year. And I would actually recommend that instead of looking at, this is data for print, double data, I want to say.
And you have to remember, over the past couple of years though,
Right.
there were considerations with regard to the
Right.
state assessment. So even though it's from a while back, these are probably the more accurate representation of that cohort,
Right, that's what
even though they're not the same kids.
Right, what I was gonna suggest is that why don't we look at fourth graders, fourth graders, fifth graders, last year's fourth graders, so this year's fifth graders in WA. They're not in WA scores from last year, so that's last year's fourth graders. And the year, and then the year before, they're the same cohort of kids, 2 years in a row. So that, because the NWA scores are actually a predictor of the state assessment, how they would do in the state assessment, is that correct? I feel that's what I've heard. That's what we were told, that's what the district has been saying all along, right?
So you're-
NWA scores are predictors of state assessment. Okay, so if we're looking at sending this year's fifth graders into new middle schools, why don't we look at their scores from the NWA scores from last year?
I would like to see 3 years of fifth grade scores, or 5 years of fifth grade scores, just to eliminate whatever random fluke happened where this class did great or this class did poorly, to say, the ceiling was leaking, or, you know what I mean, something happened away in that day, it's like, I would like to see an average of a few years of fifth grade scores, I think that's the best, I think that tells us, again,
So we can
After
pull
all
that,
the
because
school-
those are board reports, so we could pull those board reports and send them to you to look at the NWA, because every year we do
Right.
that report. to the
Yeah.
board. So we can do that for the past 3 years,
perfect.
and then you can see that with the backup information and
And-
the explanation.
And instead of actually just looking at the scores of the schools overall, maybe we can just focus on this last, of the scenario 24 through 28, look at that, what does that make it look like? Like, what does that look like, or even 23, for these scenarios with this new data? Like, what does it look like?
So run the NWEA for what would be fourth grade or fifth grade for 24 through 28. So
The Victorian wants 3 years of that.
I don't think 3 years of fifth grade, but, yeah. I think that's where the kids emerge, they might have a weak third grade team and a strong fourth grade team, but I think, and again, it's like, who do you emerge? What's your score when you leave fifth grade from this school, having gone through the whole, however many years you're there?
Well,
So we can definitely pull the board reports on that.
I can probably make a new one of these in, 2-3 minutes, because all it does is you change the data set at the very bottom of the sheet, and it'll all.
And it'll pop.
Probably. And I personally really liked the last, the 24 through 28, I would like us to preserve more than 2 options for the board to consider and for us to keep considering. And so that we can see it more globally. I also like 24 because in Dan's scenario, I'd like to keep it to see how it works because that's the scenario that has a Montessori going to not open, I think. So that's that's another option that we should like keep looking at, essentially. And see how that plays out, transportation as well, and with all the other considerations. I think that those last 24 to 28 capture everything that we want to be looking at.
This is Talia, and if there's going to be an update to the spreadsheet, if it's possible to have real population numbers, that would be great. If the district feels that the estimated numbers on here are close enough, then I'm okay with that. But if there's a possibility to have what some of those real numbers are, if we're already doing it, don't do the work if we're not making changes. But if we're making changes, that would be good.
So do you want those to be the closest numbers that we have every month? We have a gradation report which shows those enrollment numbers. So we can pull last month's report, because this one won't be out until, well, this is last week pretty much, so it'll be out this week. So we can definitely pull the gradation report this month and use those numbers.
Yeah, just to help us have an understanding of, how close are we to that 650 mark for each of these different scenarios we're considering, especially because we have to allow wiggle room for unpredictable situations. Like, we don't want to hit 650 in every scenario because we need to have that wiggle room. People could just move, and then their homeschool changes and therefore their middle school might change.
I'm sorry, what were you saying?
I was gonna say, if we're looking at moving forward, I'm not sure we can absolutely provide the gradation report.
Yeah.
But for this purpose, to look at where it would balance out, the current numbers would be the numbers that we would look at.
So there's no situation we need to be concerned about, like, oh, this year could be thrown off by their, for instance, dual language will have a class that graduates that's bigger, that's full 24, and a class that graduates that's 18. You multiply that out by a school that's 3 deep, that could make a big difference in 1 year, but maybe that doesn't really happen, and it doesn't really matter.
At least in the papers they give out, the overall district's population is fairly static and is actually declining, so.
So do we not
It
need,
just
we
doesn't-
don't need averages we don't need several years of averages for school population data or fifth grade population data, as long as we have one good number.
I think it's sort of two purposes, right? To build the school population piece, it'd be best to have the data for this month, or most current. The only problem is, the way these calculations work is the weighted averages use the number of students. So if those grades don't correspond to that number of students, you start changing your data a little bit, that you wanna.
We can, so I can definitely provide you, what we can do is look at it. We're looking at October right now. And that's something that you would need to decide. Would you like October for 3 years? Or do you want October to October? Do you want all October? Or do you want the end of the year? Do you want where the school landed at the end of the year? Because 3 years ago, like I said, we do those monthly. And so at the end of the year, we just go back and pull the ones that were submitted to the board for, June of every year. So you can see the past. But right now, we'll be looking at October.
I don't know, it's fine. I think October will be fine. I think June, end of year numbers could be fine. It is interesting that in magnet schools, there's often a big difference between September and October, because a bunch of kids move in, like when a spot is determined to be empty, then they release it to kids who are waiting for whatever. So it's interesting that September numbers, I would say, well, don't use those because our numbers have become much more real in October. But again, October versus June, I don't have it.
So how would you like the gradation reports? October to October, or October for this year, and then, well, for right now, for these purposes, and then did you want to look at June?
Anyone else have an opinion on that? I'm not sure.
I think as long as these population numbers are about right, I don't think it really matters. Because I think you're gonna say, well, every school is gonna change every year. Like, there isn't, it's not like, oh, we fill up these 30 kids in this class and then we move to the next school. So I think there's always gonna be some variance, as long as these are within, if each of these numbers is within 5 of what they would say this year's numbers are, I think the whole thing's fine.
Fed's reporting used to be a day, right, a snapshot on a
Yeah,
day. It's not that way anymore. It's a little more rolling.
Oh, is that right?
But it's always been October. So, I think, and that's what number we use when we're looking at our annual charter school growth, and we use the end of October number, so.
That's
So we
fine.
can do October year over year.
October number.
I don't know, in our COVID year last year, such a wacky school year, did it change our enrollment data in such a significant way that we should be looking at it, or is it like, fine?
Enrollment was enrollment, whether they were in person or whether they were virtual, the enrollment numbers were the enrollment numbers, but we did see a decline in enrollment overall.
I guess that's the other question. Do you want to model declined enrollment, or do you want to model what I have, which is like, I guess, ideal or
Normal year.
normal, you know, like,
I think the VEDS data is the best data for us to use because that's what's consistent.
I mean-
We have two things that we're going to bring back, that we will provide for you, the reports for the 3 years of the 5th grade NWEA, and also the gradation reports, and then we will provide the October numbers, for Beds Day, or what numbers we have for this October, so that we can look at the population.
It's interesting to ponder these, like, is the question with the distances, is the question how many kids need to be bused, or how many schools need to be bused? Or is the question actually, how close can we get? I'm not really, it's interesting to wrap your mind around, like, how to use that data.
I mean, the real question here is, for instance, should we be sending Ash to North Albany all the way across town? It doesn't matter for the families that live there, right, before they go there. But do they actually live in that part of town, right, or not, right? So I'm
It
not-
doesn't make a difference, more than do live on that side of town, but certainly not all of them.
So it is 7:31, and we have had a very robust conversation, and thank you, Dorian, and thank you, Dan, for all your work. It's absolutely great. We are so excited about this, but I do have some homework for you for our next time. Dan, you have homework anyway, okay? But when you look at these scenarios, if it's my understanding, what I hear the consensus of the group is looking at scenarios 24 through 28, taking them all on and looking at them. If you could jot down from what you're looking at, maybe 2 to 3 strengths of that scenario and 2 to 3 areas of improvement for that scenario where you may see the gaps. And you don't need to email them ahead of time. And even if you may not get a chance to do it, we're not going to take points off. You still have to be a part of the committee. But that way we can have some discussion about what the strengths are of each scenario, what are some questions that you may have about the scenario or areas of improvement for that particular scenario, so that we can look at whittling down even closer. And then we will have this information to you because, again, those are roughly board reports that we can just consolidate and send them to you. And so our next meeting, which we already know, we're gonna have another meeting. Do we want to say 2 weeks? That puts us November 9th, which still gets us in before the 18th, which is a board meeting. Does Tuesday, November 9th work?
But we need to make a final decision.
We would need to make a final decision.
Do we feel comfortable thinking there's gonna be one more meeting?
If not, we can always, I can definitely let the board know that you want 2 more meetings before we share with them, but we could at least on the 18th provide, even if we don't have a recommendation, we could at least provide the information that we have thus far.
Okay.
can I just, would it be possible, just like, you know, we named the very broad, like, public and agreeable criteria. Would it be possible to just have, like, staff look at the last 10 or even the last 5 and just say, listen, these are the inside baseball things you wouldn't think of, that like, this is why, I know it looks fine, but like, it's this and this, or like, because I think that that's really what's missing from this. It's the like practical implementation, like what does staff think?
And if, and I know we have staff on the line, so, and I know.
And I don't want to keep them, not now.
Right, but what I'm saying is, you've looked at 24 to 28, so we can focus on those, and then we'll look at the others, and if there's something else that comes up, we can toss that into the mix, but we could start with 24 to 28.
Cool.
Okay?
I would also say that I personally think that a tighter deadline.
Okay,
I probably can't do, not if I could just do it virtually, I could do the 15th in person. Unless I put a
Not the
kid out,
ninth?
unless I put a kid out there with a.
not the night.
I probably can't do next week in person at all, as I'll be solo parenting. Again, I can put a kid out there with a book and some activities to do, and that's an option, or I can do the 15th in person.
Hey, you drop a kid.
COVID makes it so hard. Like, oh, childcare.
No, we all had COVID, now we're done.
Nice.
Now we're done, more COVID.
Can you also send this out to the group? It's up your Excel sheet.
Yeah, I sent the link, but wait, listen.
Oh, okay.
It's the same link I had sent.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, like it's still all the same.
all right.
And I think I'm gonna be done tinkering with it. It's a little updated from these papers, but just like there's some more labels.
Hey, so that's fine.
I'll make sure everyone has
The
it.
15th is tight. The 15th is tight, but we can definitely do it and have it ready for, the 18th.
Now let's do this. Or is the night better for everybody
Does
else?
it have to be a paper or,
One of those is a Monday, one of those is a Monday.
The 15th is a Monday night.
No, the 15th, I'm in New York. I can't do it.
All right. So the night,
The 9th.
I will either be virtual or I will, the child lobby.
So we're looking at the 9th, same time,
Really, I'll be fine.
6 to 7:30. And yes, we will mail the latest reports.
Thank you. And the 9th works for me.
All right, perfecto.
And so we would potentially have the option for one more meeting after the 9th if we feel like we need it, but still present some stuff to the board on the 18th. That's what we settled on?
That is correct.
Okay, okay.
Thank you all so very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
So think about your spokesperson.